Saturday Night at the Movies, the podcast that celebrates classic, cult, and current films and the people that made them, and many other aspects of pop culture. I'm your host, Steve Rubin. Our producer is Ben Shrewsbury, and our signature theme was composed by Greg Lerhoff. Here it's always Saturday night, and our mission is to chronicle film and pop cultural history one memory at a time. Tonight, my friend, film historian, and writer Avie Hern and I tackle one of our all-time favorite films, director John Frankenheimer and writer Rod Serling's Cold War thriller, 7 Days in May. Featuring an all-star cast including Burt Lancaster, Kirk Douglas, Ava Gardner, Edmond O'Brien, Martin Balsam, Hugh Marlowe, George Macready, Andrew Duggan, and an uncredited John Houseman, this is one crackling suspense picture, probably more timely than ever. Welcome, Avie.
Hi, Steve. How are you?
I'm great. I'm great. One of the joys of doing this podcast is we can actually choose any topic we want in any time period and any decade. And I have to say that I probably every year or two, I put 7 Days in May on just for the pure joy of watching not only these great actors, but a terrific story.
Yeah, there are very few movies that I can watch anytime, any day, come in the beginning, come in the middle, come in the end. I will watch it. Even films that are higher on my list of favorites, I have to be kind of in the mood to watch them. But not this film. This, along with Sunset Boulevard, is just like a come in anytime, any place movie. Patton is another one.
Oh, yeah. No, absolutely. Absolutely. And I must confess that the key to casting this movie were the three leads, the basic Burt Lancaster, Kirk Douglas, and of course Fredric March. Um, I can't think of a better cast for this kind of movie at that period. Now, you mentioned to me when we were talking earlier today that this originally was possibly Kirk Douglas was going to play the James Scott General. Is that true?
Yes, he was going to play General Scott, but he just thought. I mean, remember Kirk had been he's co-producer of the movie. And he had been producing films for about 9 years at that point. He had a pretty good grasp on, in terms of casting that had nothing to do with him personally. And he thought that Burt would be a better, it's a more flamboyant part. It's not the most important part. Jiggs Casey is the center of the movie. His moral conundrum is the center of the movie. His devotion to the Constitution, whether he should go to the president or not. Learning about Project
I should tell our listeners and viewers that for those of you who have never seen 7 Days in May, I'll give you a quick basic, but no, won't give you any spoilers because we try not to do that on this podcast. But basically, uh, Fredric March is playing the President of the United States. And essentially, he is a fairly liberal president. He's trying to make nice with the Russians at a time when the Cold War was at its height. And he's agreed to a nuclear test ban that the military is dead set against. They don't trust the Russians, and they're epitomized by Burt Lancaster's character, General James Mattoon Scott, who has more medals than you can shake a stick at, including the Medal of Honor. Very respected Air Force general, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and a major character in the military. His direct assistant, his deputy, is Kirk Douglas's character, Colonel Casey. His nickname is Jiggs Casey. And early in the story, you begin to suspect that Burt Lancaster's General Scott is up to no good, and that the generals in Washington are actually planning a coup. And that's the basic setup for 7 Days in May. And I know that you're a big fan of Kirk Douglas, Avie. He's always been one of your favorite actors. I think this is a less showy role for him. Burt Lancaster has the bigger part in terms of kind of showiness. What can you tell us about Jiggs Casey?
Well, I think it's a notable part for Douglas because you're never going to find a part that he did in which he was more controlled. Jiggs Casey is the subordinate of both just General Scott and the president and the people immediately around the president. He can't really, whatever he feels, they can only hint at, and he can only talk about kind of obliquely. And so, I mean, I would be interested in knowing Kirk's reasoning. I mean, yeah, he saw Burt Lancaster was better for General Scott, and he was right. But I was wondering if he kind of wondered whether he could rein it in and just keep it, keep Jiggs Casey on a very, very even keel. Which is very unlike most of his other parts. He's very good at playing. I mean, Kirk specialized in playing men whose mainsprings were wound way too tight, and
Which
even
so which role would you say epitomizes that?
oh, gee, I mean, Ace in the Hole,
The
Bad
reporter.
and Beautiful. I mean, any of those movies where he played, a real heel, but no one played heels better than Kirk. Um,
And he
but
was the original thought to play Sefton in Stalag 17.
according to him, it was, yes. And he turned it down because he'd seen the play on Broadway and didn't like it. And even though he had just finished a film for Wilder, it didn't occur to him that Wilder takes material and totally remakes it in his own image. And that it would, the script Wilder would eventually come up with would be very, very different from the stage play. Stage play was just a jumping off place.
Sure.
And for the rest of his life, Douglas said turning it down was the biggest mistake he ever made.
Kirk Douglas is this a Bryna production? Is he the
It's a co-production. In fact, I think it's a Joel production. It's named one of Douglas's sons,
right?
and one of the other. I'd have to look at the credits, but one of the other co-producers is Norma, which was Burt Lancaster's production company, and then there was Frankenheimer's own company, and I can't remember offhand what the name of that one is. It'll
Now,
come.
this is based on a popular novel by Fletcher Nebel and is it John Waters?
Uh,
James Warren. We should look this up because we shouldn't be presenting false
yeah,
information.
absolutely.
Um, I have not read the book, but it is on my list of retro books to read because I want to see how they changed the book into the movie. And I should say that this movie was adapted, as I mentioned in the introduction, by Rod Serling. And I would say next to Planet of the Apes, this is probably Rod Serling's not only most famous work in theatrical films, but certainly one of his most successful.
But just as you cast actors for film, you cast writers too. And it would be interesting to know what led them to Serling as opposed to getting somebody else who worked more on features than Serling did.
Well, you're getting a very fresh Serling right off the Twilight Zone. The Twilight Zone's last production was in '64, so he was probably already working on the script in the last season of the Twilight Zone.
So what was it again? Oh, Charles W. Bailey,
Charles
Campbell
W. Bailey and Fletcher Nebel, they were the
Bailey the second. Yeah.
yes, they were the original writers of it's interesting concerning Rod Serling, and for those of you who don't know it, I wrote the Twilight Zone Encyclopedia, so I did a lot of research into the life of Rod Serling, and in fact, I got terrific cooperation from his widow, Carol. And the thing about Rod Serling as a writer is he had an adeptness with dialogue, especially the dialogue of everyday people. I think the key to the success of the Twilight Zone was his ability to present ordinary people in extraordinary situations and in dialogue that seemed like it could be spoken by anybody. And so, in a movie like 7 Days in May, which is not really an action movie, it's really a dramatic movie set in rooms. There are some action sequences toward the end of the movie, but for the most part, it is a point counterpoint battle of wills between the president and General Scott.
Yeah. Yeah. But even though they don't have that many scenes together, I mean, much of what Jiggs is doing is with the president, the head of the Secret Service, and in a way, it's kind of like Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, where Kirk and Khan are never in the same room together, and yet they are scorpions in a bottle.
No, that's so true.
And also, the things that you also think about, and I think I mentioned this when we talked earlier today, that Lancaster was a much bigger man than Kirk, easily 3 inches taller and just bigger. And in addition to Jiggs Casey's being his subordinate, he's also his physical inferior, and that creates a dynamic between the two men, which is actually quite interesting.
The
And
uh, the story is set in the near future, and there's some question as to what the actual date is. This movie was released. It was originally going to be released at the end of 1963, but at Burt Lancaster's request, they after the assassination of John F. Kennedy on November 22nd that year, they pushed the release date back to 1964, which apparently they also did for Stanley Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove. Both films were originally slated for December 63. But it is a little semi-futuristic America. And in fact, in this scene, for those of you who are viewing this on YouTube, you can see Burt Lancaster using a video conferencing system in 1964, which of course was at that time was unknown to the general public. And some of the trappings of the Pentagon are a little futuristic with these digital clocks at the beginning. I always thought it was very interesting. You walk into the Pentagon and you have that flashing clock. It was kind of an interesting, and it is kind of a countdown movie because this all takes place in the title, Seven
well,
Days in
seven
May.
days, yes. Although one thing I've never understood about it is because they have to think of a logical reason for the Preakness to take place on Sunday. So they have a little, a poster saying first ever Sunday running of the Preakness. And I was thinking, well, why couldn't all of this have begun on a Sunday so that it ended on a Saturday when the Preakness is actually run? And there's actually no reason for them never not to have done that. It makes no sense. But I mean, they added it.
It's
They
called
just made a
over.
complication for themselves, which
Yeah,
wasn't.
it's overcomplicating things, etc. The other thing I learned is that John F. Kennedy was a big fan of this project. And
Paramount was nervous that that he would be offended and that they wouldn't be able to get any permission to shoot in Washington at all and in front of the White House. And it turned out just the opposite. Kennedy greased the wheels for them, and he loved the book, and
the production designer was allowed into the White House to look at the offices of the president and the Oval Office, and certainly they got access to places they wouldn't normally. Although they didn't get access to the Pentagon. I guess there's one sequence where Kirk is walking into, I guess it's an exterior. He's walking into the actual Pentagon, and
yeah,
they kind of shot it from inside a station wagon. Not
he
a
stole the shot.
He was in his full major's outfit, and as he's walking into the Pentagon, officers are coming by and they're saluting him, and he's
Yeah.
saluting them back. And nobody real. Although I don't know, by 1964, I'm sure a few of those military personnel did a little bit of a double take because Kirk Douglas is a fairly high
Yeah,
visibility.
exactly. But getting back to the video conferencing for a moment, there's a scene where the president is talking to a head of the an air transport wing and telling him that his planes have to stand down and not obey any orders they get from Scott and ComCom. And the general he's talking to is actually Ferris Webster, the film's editor.
Oh, really? That's interesting.
Very good in the part.
Harris Webster, who I believe was nominated for an Oscar, or no, I'm thinking. Was he Forbidden Planet? No, that's
Yes,
Forbidden Planet.
he edited that too.
Yeah. Oh, he did. Okay.
Huh?
Yeah, I thought I recognized the name. Well, the movie itself, as I mentioned, is filled with some wonderful actors. I'm going to bring up some of them now. We've got to start with of course the president, Fredric March. I think, as you've pointed out, who better person to play the president of the United States than Fredric March? And I've really loved March for years, probably primarily because I love his film, The Best Years of Our Lives, the William Wyler film where he plays Sergeant Al Stevenson, a returnee from World War II. You've been a big fan of March's as well.
Yeah, although it's really interesting to compare March and his contemporary Spencer Tracy. You look at them in the early 30s. March was a hammy actor. He was a stage actor, and he had to learn how to act in front of the camera. But Tracy just knew how to do it from the moment he stepped in front of the camera, and he changed very, very little throughout his career. March got subtler and subtler as he went through the 30s and the 40s. I mean, he was a subtler actor in Best Years of Our Lives than anything he did in the 30s. And the subtler he got, the more powerful he got as an actor. By the time he does 7 Days in May, I mean, it's just a tremendously powerful performance. It's a wonderfully measured and deft performance. And as far as I'm concerned, he's the best movie president ever.
There's been a lot of presidents, actors as presidents, and I would agree with you. Now, if I'm not mistaken, isn't Fredric March opposite Spencer Tracy in Inherit the Wind?
Oh yeah, only film they ever made together. And again, it's really interesting. I mean, in a way, there it's kind of like Douglas and Lancaster in this film is that March's character is the more flamboyant of the two. I mean, Tracy is for the most part has a much quieter part.
Are you talking about Inherit the Wind?
Yeah, and but also the thing is that after they each became movie stars, Tracy, who started on the stage, never went back to the stage. It scared the hell out of him. He just never wanted to do it again. Whereas March routinely went back. And I think March was, even though I think Tracy is the greatest screen actor of all time, I think that March was the more daring actor. He would try things that Tracy would never try.
Did they, if I'm trying to remember the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Now, wasn't Spencer Tracy in Dr. or am I confusing him with Frederick?
No, they each met. March won an Oscar for doing it in 1932, and Tracy played it in 1941,
There
opposite
you go. There you
Goodman.
go. I read in the notes, by the way, that Spencer Tracy was considered for the role of President Lyman. So that would have been interesting. I'm not sure what he was doing at the time and why he turned down the role, or perhaps they just couldn't get him. But Fredric March has some major moves. Now, in this scene here, for those of you who are viewing, I have him sitting next to an actor named George Macready. And George Macready plays a rather acerbic character. He's one of the president's advisors. And when Jiggs Casey starts to bring the president up to speed on what he knows about this projected coup, George Macready plays the counterpoint. He doesn't believe any of it. And I always think George Macready is a great character playing kind of a stuffed up person.
Well, there's always something vaguely sinister about him, even when he played a good character. Um, he was not someone. He was not. He never played a warm character. I mean, you may remember him as the Secretary of State. That's his actual name in Tora Tora Tora. He's sitting there with the ambassador, with the Japanese ambassador, Kurosu, or Nomura, one of the two. And then the news comes in that Pearl Harbor has just been bombed ahead of the Japanese ultimatum because the Japanese they kept waiting for to be translated and be typed and everything. Anyway, the planes went ahead and bombed Pearl Harbor, and Macready just looks at them and says, "Go, just go." And Macready, he gave that a lot of weight. He was this kind of character where you don't really expect to feel any kind of real depth of emotion from him, but it's there, even though he doesn't shout it. It's actually a very quiet moment, but
He has a nice role. He has a nice role opposite James Mason in The Desert Fox. He plays Fritz Bayerlein, who was one of Rommel's lieutenants or officers, and I thought it was a good role for him. But Macready's good in this, as is everybody. There's not a bad performance in this whole grouping. And as we move down the line, I'm going to bring up a very, very popular young lady at the time, uh, in the prime of her career, Ava Gardner. Um, I mean, I'm sure I'm actually curious. I will probably read the book one day. I'm wondering if Eleanor Holbrook is actually in the book because the relationship she plays General General Scott's former mistress
mhm.
and a good friend of Kirk Douglas's Jiggs Casey character. And I always liked Ava Gardner. I've been kind of catching up on her filmography lately. I watched Bowani Junction
Mhm.
recently, which is a very good film, done about a decade before this movie. What's your thoughts on the whole thing with Ava Gardner?
Well, I think she was cast more on the name of her on the weight of her name rather than But she was a competent actress. She wasn't a great actress. She was past her prime as a screen goddess, but I think they wanted somebody who was a little past that, who was a believable mistress for somebody like General Scott. Not like Miss Foreign Affairs, with General Turgidson and Dr. Strangelove. A little more settled than that.
Much more subtle, and she certainly is playing an edgy character because she's an alcoholic. I mean, basically
Yeah, in
failed.
real life. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, in real life as well?
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Well, anyway, she still looks pretty damn good in 1964. I think she's about to do, is it Night of the Iguana? I think, or perhaps that was the year before. But yeah,
I'd have to look, but it's around that time.
and then of course the previous year she had played opposite Charlton Heston in one of my little guilty pleasure favorites, 55 Days at Peking.
One of mine too.
Yes, with that great oh, it has that Dmitri Tiomkin music. Of course, is not what you particularly like to talk about because I know you don't like Dmitri Tiomkin. But in this movie, 7 Days in May, we get the wonderful Jerry Goldsmith, and as you pointed out, it's not a big score because there's not a lot of music in the movie. But when there is music, it's very affecting.
Mhm. It
I
is.
like.
When you score a movie, the producer, director sits down with the composer and does what's called spotting music. They say, I want music here, I don't want music there. And then the composer will come up with some themes, and they'll demo it on the piano for the producer, and decide, is this what you want, or is you want something different? And it's a whole process. And obviously they sat down watching this movie, and somebody said probably just said the drama is going to needs to be spare. It needs to be carry itself, and we don't want to be really manipulating people's emotions with music. We
Yeah,
want
no, it's a sparse. It is a sparse score.
no.
Um, the political side of this movie, this is during the big period. I mean, we're in the midst of the Cold War in '64. We've just had a horrible assassination of a beloved president. Now there are a whole spate of Cold War thrillers. Obviously, we're talking tonight about 7 Days in May. There was Dr. Strangelove. There was Failsafe. There was the Bedford incident. Do you think Hollywood was basically responding to the texture of the world by doing these types of thrillers?
They were, obviously, it's going to, it's always going to be a question among studio executives. I mean, how deeply do we want to get into this trend or that trend? I mean, because when you follow trends, it tends to bite you because you can't help but be behind the trend because the public's already where it is, and by the time you make a movie, public has moved on to something else. So I mean, there weren't a lot of Cold War films, but I mean, there were often spy films. I mean, genuine, not James Bond films, but genuine spy films, like The Spy Came In From the Cold and things like that. But um, they're not happy movies, and they're not the kind of movies that really get people hugely enthusiastic. I mean, that's another problem. You have a movie that may be a great movie, but it doesn't get people like stop their friends on when they see them and grab them by the lapel and say, "Go see this movie."
Here's an interesting question. It's 1964. This movie is released in black and white. Um, any particular reason?
As far as I know, no, but there's something about black and white that lends itself to something like this. I mean, remember in the '60s, a lot of films were still being made in black and white. I mean, it was not out of the ordinary at all. Um,
Well, yeah,
but
the reason I bring it up is Rod Serling is coming off of 5 years of The Twilight Zone, all of which was shot in black and white
right.
and very effectively. And as we've talked about this many times, when you shoot black and white, you're taking away a little bit of contemporary reference so that the audience is already a little bit their, off their normal sweet spot. So I think it adds a little it's the word verisimilitude to the whole process.
Mhm.
Yeah, and very effective. Let's talk a little bit about some of the other cast members because this movie, and I'll say it over and over again, is full of great characterizations. I'm going to bring up a picture of one of your favorites, Mr. Edmond O'Brien. Tell us a little bit about his character.
Well, Senator Ray Clark of Georgia. I mean, it's a flamboyant character where he's in many ways. I mean, they send him out to find out what's out in the desert where they've apparently located the Ecomcon base, fearing that he could probably be he'd be less obtrusive as a Southerner, and he might just seem like less like some kind of Washington bureaucrat who would be of whom people would be suspicious. But of course, that doesn't work. He ends up behind locked doors. But of course, in many ways, he's also the conscience of President Lyman. They state in the movie that he's Lyman's best friend, and you get the feeling that Lyman may not have done what he did, and if Clark hadn't come on board and believed what Casey presented.
Frankenheimer had just hired him for a brief role at the end of The Birdman of Alcatraz, I believe.
Right.
He plays the journalist who greets
Mhm.
Robert Stroud as he gets off the boat, having been released from Alcatraz.
Yeah.
Yeah, Eddie O'Brien is definitely one of those great character actors we do not have enough of these days.
No, again, I mean, he lends such enormous gravitas to all the. I recently caught. I hadn't seen the film in 45 years. It used to play on television all the time. It was a 1955 version of a 56 version of 1984. He plays Winston Smith, and it's not terribly good, but it's interesting. It's kind of a product of its time. He's very good. He kind of holds the movie together. He and Jan Sterling, who was in Ace in the Hole and The High and
Right.
the Mighty. Uh, but you look at him from his earliest parts, like in Hunchback of Notre Dame, where he plays Clopin, and he's actually svelte, and then you go through the 40s, and he gets heavier and heavier, and
Well,
becomes more of a character.
he's also has that tiny little cameo at the very end of The Greatest Show on Earth,
It's true, in
1952.
the revolving circus wagon wheel, yeah.
Exactly, exactly.
Which it struck me as kind of odd. I mean, why would DeMille, a man who was 2 years away from winning an Oscar, and had made a name for himself in things like DOA in the 40s, and suddenly says, "Oh, I want Edmond O'Brien to play the circus barker for like 15 seconds in this movie." I would be interested in knowing why.
Well, maybe the chance of working with DeMille was something. Now, Edmond O'Brien is playing a Southern senator. And then we have another actor, Whit Bissell, playing the California senator. And Whit
Yeah.
Bissell has been in a million movies. He usually plays a fairly agreeable guy. It's so funny because I'm thinking of flashing on all of his movies, and he plays, I believe he plays the psychiatrist in Invasion of the Body Snatchers in
Uh-huh.
56, 8 years earlier. And he's been in a lot of different things. He plays Senator Prentice here from California. What can you tell us about Senator Prentice?
Bissell played characters who, when they were respectable characters and they wore suits and ties, there was something kind of clinical about them. They were all immaculately groomed and very clipped in how they spoke, that could be a genuine reflection of who they were, but sometimes it was as with Senator Prentice, I mean, it's kind of a smokescreen for being a devious character. And of course, he's in league with, I mean, I'm sure you'll get to the Hugh Marlowe character. And they're kind of cut from the same mold. But Bissell's. I mean, he worked for like 50 years, and he played all sorts of characters. Yeah, I mean, you're a character actor, you play with a certain range. I mean, that's why they hire you. But he was always into bad, always working, and I've always liked him ever since. I think the first thing I ever saw him in was probably when I was a kid. And he was the General Kirk in the Twilight Zone in the Time Tunnel.
Sure. Sure. Well remembered with James Darren. And since my kids are named Jamie and Darren, I would think I was inspired by that.
Not lost in time.
Um,
They're not moon. They're not Moondoggy in a Gidget movie.
no, they're not Moondoggy and a Gidget movie. I think we just recently lost James Darren.
Yes.
I actually almost booked him on my show. but unfortunately, it did not get to him on time, which is unfortunate.
Well,
Uh,
when somebody who you're most familiar with, an actor you're most familiar with, is from when they were quite young, and you didn't really get that great a sense of how they aged. It just seems like they've been plucked from us way, way too soon. Because he was probably, I don't know how old he was, probably like 82 or something.
yeah. Here's Hugh Marlowe, and of
Yeah.
course, as film buffs, we always remember Hugh Marlowe as kind of the bad insurance guy in The Day the Earth Stood Still, who
Yeah.
is going to sell out Klaatu. And
I don't care about the rest of the world.
but it's funny because when I think of Hugh Marlowe, I also think of the wonderful role he played in and the wonderful arc he has in 12 O'Clock High.
Well, yeah, I was going to bring that up because it's like he's basically the guy that in General Savage's eyes cannot do any right, and eventually
Right.
it's like Savage assigns like every screw up bomber crew member to his plane. There's you're gonna you're gonna paint leper colony on your ship because you rate it.
You do a good Greg Peck. Always good. But Marlowe, it's been, I mean, he's been in so many movies. I mean, he's in All About Eve for Joe Mankiewicz, and of course, for Robert Wise in The Day the Earth Stood Still. And tell us a little bit about the character he plays in 7 Days in May.
Well, he's I've never been clear what exactly he does. I mean, he's part of the group around General Scott who are arranging the media blitz that they're going to need to get the American people on board.
He's kind of a kind of a kind of a how would you describe him? He's a bit of a firebrand of a speaker. I mean, he
Yeah,
basically has a huge following. He's going to address the veterans of foreign wars, which is given a different name in the movie. But I think in PR parlance, he's Scott's drum beater. And
yeah,
basically, when he gives his his introduction, it's just off the charts. And then Casey later talks to Scott about that, and Scott asks him how did he like the speech and what did you think of McPherson? And I think Casey says that he was a bit overripe, and rather than agree with, or actually Scott agrees with him and says, "Yes, that's why I like him."
yeah.
But
Well,
he's kind of like the Rush Limbaugh of his age, I think.
well, I think there was always kind of an unctuous quality about Marlowe, and so it's always kind of interesting to me that Columbia decided to cast him as the hero in Earth versus the Flying Saucers, possibly on the strength of the Years Stood Still. But I find him kind of it's like let the aliens take him. I mean, I honestly we would be better off leave Joyce Taylor to me. You know, I mean, she's an actress I've always liked, so they were not really made for each other.
No, I think that Scott surrounds himself with a cabal of interesting characters as he's piloting toward this coup, and I think McPherson, the character that Marlowe plays, is very much of that ilk. And I'm going to put up another picture here in a second of a character who is actually uncredited in the movie. Um, He's the famous actor. We know him very well from Paper Chase, Mr. John Houseman.
He did the part as a favor to Frankenheimer, but only on condition that he wouldn't get screen credit. He didn't want it, and so at what how he decided to become an actor with screen credit with doing Paper Chase with for James Bridges, I don't know. At what point did he say, why not turn this into my new job? Of course, he won an Oscar for that and never looked back.
And he's interestingly, for those of us who aren't familiar with the acting business, he is a very prominent acting teacher.
He was, and before that, I mean, he was this Orson Welles' associate.
Isn't he involved in the War of the Worlds?
War of the Worlds, Mercury Theater, and Citizen Kane, and then he became a producer in his own right and produced a lot of important films, mainly at MGM in the '50s, like Lust for Life with Kirk Douglas, and arguably his greatest performance. And
Did you say
Uh,
that Lust for Life is Kirk Douglas's greatest performance?
Arguably, yeah.
Okay, that's interesting. We have to talk about it
And
another time. Here he's playing Admiral Barneswell, who is a U.S. Navy admiral based in the Mediterranean, and he's visited by one of the other characters who, and it's a dramatic moment. And that other character, I'm going to put a picture up here for those of you who can view. And that is, let's see if I can find it. Oh, yes, he's here on the right. That's Martin Balsam,
another Oscar winner.
another Oscar winner who plays Paul Gerard, who's an executive assistant to the president. Another great actor.
Yes, yes. I mean, not nearly as appreciated as he should have been. He was just one of those actors who's always there, and you just took him for granted. But he was a wonderful actor. Of course, the people. I think most people, if they think about it, they remember him as one of two things. Well, they remember him as Arbogast in Psycho.
Sure.
How
And,
Arbogast meets his end in Psycho.
and then the following year, speaking of Cold War thrillers, he's in the Bedford Incident.
Hmm.
It's interesting. Frankenheimer's career as a director was fairly new in films. I mean, he had been mostly known for his television work.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, the '50s was such an incubator for men who later became feature directors, like Frankenheimer, Franklin Schaffner, Arthur Penn. I mean, just all these wonderful, wonderful directors who finally got their opportunity to move into features. Uh, the thing is, one of the most extraordinary things about Frankenheimer is the run of films he had in the '60s. I mean, Manchurian Candidate, 7 Days in May, Birdman of Alcatraz, The Train, Seconds. I mean, these are just remark. With like the one big sort of oddity in the middle of it, Grand Prix. I went to see a screening of Grand Prix at the Academy for their last 70 millimeter film festival, and his wife Evans, who was an actor, she spoke about the film, and she said the film got made because John loved auto racing. I was thinking to myself, oh, that's an awful reason for making a movie. You got to love auto racing. And it's a really, it's cobbled together story. It's spectacular, shot in ultra Panavision. I mean, it's really,
Well, it was a lot more successful than Le Mans, the Steve McQueen film,
or
which
winning
was
with Paul Newman. I mean, yeah,
which was a mess, which was a total mess. I think that Grand Prix, of course, had James Garner, who's always been a lot of fun. Let's
Mhm.
continue with our look at the faces of 7 Days in May. Um, Andrew Duggan. Now you have to explain to me how do you spell his character's last name?
Years and years I would watch the film and it always sounded like mud, M-U-D, but then it was pointed out to me, no, it's mutt, M-U-T-T, like a dog.
Mutt. This is a U.S. Army colonel who's a friend of Jiggs Casey's, who
Mhm.
he's very integral to the plot, although he's only in a few scenes. But his nickname is Mutt. But it sounds, as Avi says, it sounds like they're calling him Mud,
Yeah.
throwing mud, it's slinging mud, but it's Mutt, and he's very tall. And Andrew Duggan, I always liked Andrew Duggan, particularly his voice. He's got a good voice. He's the narrator the year before in PT 109.
I
And
didn't know that. That's interesting.
yeah, he was the narrator. And
I've always liked him. Of course, he played the president in like Flint,
right.
but or actually played the president and the imposter, who's the president's imposter. But in 7 Days in May, I mean, he is he has to deal with Senator Clark's captor, Senator Colonel
Colonel,
Broderick,
Colonel Broderick, exactly.
and at one point,
No spoilers now. Be careful.
no, but at one point, Jiggs Casey is asked about Broderick, and somebody says, uh, he's a good officer or something, and Casey says something, yeah, for some kinds of some armies, meaning
Yeah,
like,
the ones that goose.
yeah.
Yeah, he's pretty extreme, but I like Duggan, and in the one bit of action in this movie, and it's not like we're looking for action and we need action because it's got such dramatic stakes in this movie, but there is some great action out in the desert with Duggan, and I thought that was one of my favorite moments.
But I love the moment at Dulles Airport where
Oh
uh,
yes,
where uh,
Casey's got to make a. He's got to make a
oh no, Jig, no,
Ray Clark.
and Senator Clark have just escaped from the airbase, and they're going to go to the White House. And Clark goes off, and Conklin comes back, and Mutt's gone. And he and 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 Clark goes to the woman sitting there on the concourse, and she goes, "Excuse me, ma'am, do you see a
Tall
tall soldier
soldier in
standing here
a funny
in a funny
hat.
hat?"
Because Mutt is wearing a beret. Yeah, no, that was one of the more interesting moments. Definitely, definitely. The ad campaign for this movie was very good. I wanted to put up the poster real quickly if I can find it here. Or at least one of the posters. This is it had they were obviously playing up the fact that they had the movie based on the bestseller of the book and the big cast. And the fact that this could happen tomorrow is a little scary because
Yeah, it
the
certainly is.
idea of the generals taking over the country is right out of. In fact, I think if I'm not mistaken, this movie was banned in Brazil because of the military takeover of the government, just like it was portrayed in
Mhm.
the book.
Well, yeah, you think about it, if it was banned on the basis of just that, there are plenty of countries in the world, especially back then, that where it also would have been banned. You know, it was very popular to have juntas running countries back then.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. And
As a collector of movie posters, I don't think that this film had a particularly good poster. It's not. If I had one, I wouldn't exactly cherish it. I think I have an insert poster on it, but it's not an important movie.
right, right. Actually, I like the title treatment. It's very good. And then again, it goes back to that um, that understated Goldsmith score, which is very good. Now, this movie got remade, I believe, back in the '90s, early '90s, with let's see, I think Jason Robards plays the Kirk Douglas character. This was not a very good movie. It's an HBO remake, and I remember it well. Who's the black actor who's the very top of his game? I'm trying to remember. Um,
This one with Denzel Washington,
no, not Denzel
uh,
Washington. He was
uh,
the king of. Anyway, we'll remember it in a second. In fact, hang on one second. I'll pull it up. Excuse me, folks. We always have the ever handy IMDb, which of course don't leave home without it because it makes us all practitioners of film history. But the original was 64, and the
there was
remake,
a Russian version. It's not what I want.
Ends of Days in May, and okay, here we go. Is actually now interestingly, it's not listed here, which is funny.
Yeah, there's like a Russian film by that name, but
Yeah.
are you
Uh,
sure it had the same title?
I want to think it did.
Well, if it was Jason Robards, look at his filmography, and that will, you'll be able to trace
Yeah,
it
yeah,
back.
exactly. It was like it was the problem with the movie was it just didn't seem to be it just didn't have any energy like I mean, as I say in the introduction of this movie, this is a crackling thriller.
Well, that's exactly it. I mean, like, some movies have electricity and some don't. Sometimes, even with all the best intentions and the best components, they just fail to ignite in that way. Um, yeah, I think The Enemy Within. That sounds like it.
I'm looking yeah, there you go. I think you're
Just
right. It wasn't released as
playing the
yeah, they
General Scott
changed the
character.
title, and the actor
Yeah.
I'm thinking of is Forrest
Bruce
Whitaker.
Whitaker.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I should know that because I've worked with Forrest. But yes, yes. But let's get. I don't want to talk about the HBO version because even though they tried to do a good job, it was a pale representation of what I mean. The whole idea of remakes, which can be a whole topic for another email. I mean, another podcast is that more often than not, they're terrible and they lack the energy. Denzel Washington, one of our finest actors who just excels in so many things, has done some pretty awful remakes. I think the Manchurian Candidate does not work for me. Neither does the Taking of Pelham 1, 2, 3. Both of which should not have been remade because the originals were so good.
Well, if I'm, if I had the opportunity, I would like take corner anybody who was going to make a remake, pin them against the wall, and say, "What is your reason for making this movie? I mean, is there something new you're going to bring to it that the original was lacking?" So if you're not, you can't do that. There's no reason at all to make it. Doing a remake, making remakes is a fool's errand. You might as well pin a piece of paper on your back that says, "I'm an idiot. Kick me." Um, you
Well,
know,
there have been a few good ones, but I'd say out of 2,000 remakes, there have probably been 12 good ones. And it's just, particularly in the science fiction world. I mean, the remake of The Day the Earth Stood Still, forget it. Now, here I pulled up a picture for those who can see it. The final part of the movie is, and I'm not really giving things away, but Fredric March gives a speech, and you can really see the power of March's performance
yes,
in this great speech. And I think this is pure Serling. I'm not sure of how much of it was the dialogue came from the book, but Serling excelled at portraying what the future was looking like. A lot of his Twilight Zone episodes had elements of 7 Days in May in terms of tense looks at what the future could behold. We were very, as an audience, we were very fortunate that Serling wrote this script, very fortunate that John Frankenheimer directed. And my goodness, we are so happy with the cast that came out. Do you have a favorite performance in the film, Avi?
well, it's March's. Yeah, I mean, I think he steals the movie from everybody else. I don't think he tries to; he just does. I mean, the moral strength of the character just comes through in everything he does. I mean, he's not on board in the beginning of the movie either. I mean, he's skeptical, and he doesn't want to believe that what's going on is going on, and he would
He
rather
also
just go.
he also it's also pointed out that I think he says it himself that only 29% of the population thinks he should make the deal with the Russians, and yet he's going ahead with it. And it's very challenging for him to get his agenda going with so much opposition. And it's, we're living in a very politically volatile age. And if ever there was a time that somebody should write another 7 Days in May, not a remake, of course, but something reflecting of what can go wrong, it's now because there are a lot of moving parts. I'm not going to get political here, but there's a lot of things going on that the American public has never been privy to or aware of, and it's causing people a great deal of consternation. So, I mean, movies like this, this is this movie makes some terrific points about who we should trust in the world, and sometimes it's not the people you think are the highest profile people.
No, it's absolutely right, and but it's connected with what we were talking about a moment ago about remakes. When during the Iran-Contra hearings in 1986, at one point, the camera pans around the Senate committee chamber, and who's sitting in the gallery but Kirk Douglas. And afterward, a reporter asked him, "Why were you there?" And he said, "Well, I'm contemplating remaking 7 Days in May." Presumably, he owned the rights or, an interest in the rights. And as what I said a few moments ago, I mean, it's like unless you can bring something new to it, there's no point in remaking it. Now, the new thing that we brought to 7 Days in May is instead of discovering a cabal that's going to overthrow that wants to overthrow the constitutionally installed president of the United States over a peace treaty that he is entirely justified, but certainly, legally entitled to negotiate. What if you had a bunch of military officers who are confronted by an administration that refuses to adhere to the Constitution? And that, as a practical matter, would be better overthrown. And then you had a Jiggs Casey who might even agree with them, but he has devotion to the Constitution. What does he do? That's your story. And it's a really fascinating variation on the film that was made, and that would justify a remake.
Interestingly, although not directly relatable, it kind of reminds me a little bit of Watergate, where the president was overthrown eventually by revelations about his conduct. Yeah, you kind of hope that people will make the right decisions. Well, this has been interesting. I knew that we would have fun talking about this movie. For those of you who've never seen 7 Days in May, I'm sure you can find it somewhere. Turner Classic Movies usually runs it regularly. It's well worth a visit. I own a copy of it on DVD. I'm sure Avi has one too,
The
right, Avi?
Blu-ray. Yeah.
Absolutely. And definitely a fun picture. I believe it's a Paramount title, correct?
Yes, it is. Although, and I don't know who owns the rights to it. I have to go look at actually, the film was originally released by Paramount. It still bears the Paramount logo at the beginning, but I don't think it was ever owned by Paramount because it is now owned by Warner Brothers.
Oh, okay. That's interesting. Um, you have been listening to and watching Saturday Night at the Movies. I'm your host, Steve Rubin. Our producer's Ben Shrewsbury. For those of you who aren't aware, I also have a podcast called Tales from Hollywoodland, which I co-host with producers Julian Schlossberg and Arthur E. Friedman. That's available on Tales from Hollywoodland. Just Google that or just pop that into your podcast platform. With that podcast and Stephen and in Saturday Night the Movies, if you enjoy what you're listening to, please get us a positive remark. We always like positives, and if there's a place you can say something positive, even if you want to say something negative, that's your prerogative. But we appreciate comments, and if you want to reach out to me on any questions, whether recommendations for future guests or topics, you can email me at Steve, STEVEJAY, Rubin at Gmail. And thank
Put it
you.
this way. Put it this way. If you want to say if you want to say something positive, be as strident about it as you like. But if you're going to say something negative, be as gentle as you can be.
Thanks, Avi. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next week.
Bye bye.